Howdy, all of you delicious people. Who framed Roger Rabbit? Who did it? Who? I wonder. We'll find out probably by the end of this movie, I hope, because there was only one movie, so it's gonna have to tie this all up in a nice, neat little bow. I think with this film, I think the one thing that interests me is a live action character next to an animated character. Before we really did all the like you could have CGI everything and whatever. I like this kind of old fashioned approach. I like how you have dipping in these characters that looked like their cartoon counterparts, and I liked that about this movie. We ultimately have like a Bugs Bunny or a Mickey Mouse in this movie, and I think this film kind of goes into the times of things where like Mickey Mouses and Goofies and Donald Ducks aren't really hugely put to the forefront as much as they were. Like, yeah, you probably like currently to the second this recording do have like a reboot of DuckTales and stuff like that. But yeah, I think it's kind of a scarcity to see like a Goofy or a Donald or a Pluto or something like that being used heavily in like mainstream Disney stuff or animated stuff. But yeah, but we have like Daffy Duck, Bugs Bunny, and in a way of which was probably much more controversial in the early years. Where now, like, I don't think that you can actually do this movie now because I think this movie would have to try to much more appeal to kids rather than a wider audience. And so, more than likely, we would probably get a different variation of a Jessica Rabbit, or we'd probably get like a much more like uh, kind of cleaner movie, probably if this movie wasn't clean enough. Uh, Silly. But anyways, so we this is a detective movie which I can easily happily just be fine with. I think this movie and like a last action hero is like they kind of feel both like detective movies to me, but I could just like easily just buy into it and be completely utterly fine with the approaches of those movies because there is some outlandish elements to Last Action Hero as well as this film. When when I think we're presented within this movie Toontown, we're not really quite seeing exactly what that means, and I wish that we could have saw more of it. Because really, you're kind of seeing little shades here and there of some stuff, but really, you have really just kind of one whole scene of this with which has Bob Hopkins, Eddie Valiant in it, and that kind of showcases like okay, you have a guy that is otherwise immersed in a Looney Tunes like environment, and ultimately he is getting tripped up, getting flopped around, and whatever. That's the one thing that ultimately, when watching this movie, I'm like, God, how many times did Ed Hopkins' character like have to do so many flips and so many uh, like like he had to be like uh, thrown or tossed or just flipped around or how many times did he had to like fall on his face or get thrown somewhere or this and that, like how many times did they have to do that in this movie, as well as how many times did they probably have to do maybe different takes of him getting tossed or rolled or whatever. uh, I don't like to have known that, but probably any number of people that have done this movie that probably maybe are all unfortunately not alive anymore, probably. But that's okay, because, yeah, anyways. Because I know Bob sadly had passed away. Anyways, so, but hey, Christopher Lloyd is still going on. Like, we still have Christopher Lloyd, who ultimately plays Judge Doom in this movie. So, ultimately, when hearing or realizing that Kathleen Turner was voice of Jessica Rabbit in this movie, I'm like, oh yeah, like of course I remember Kathleen Turner from a Steve Martin movie. I think it was The Man of Two Brains. I thought that movie was like bizarre, but I also thought it was funny. So I once I saw Kathleen Turner, I was like, oh my god, yeah, that is who was actually that voice. Like the entire time, it was bugging me of who when we actually get to see Jessica Rabbit. I was like, okay, like I was like, where is that voice coming from? Because I found it very familiar. So going in this movie, it's a very old fashioned noir like style detective movie, and we have Bob Hopkins who plays Eddie Valiant, and Eddie Valiant is of course a character that doesn't like tunes, but seems to be otherwise tied to certain cases that involve tunes in some capacity. So we also have a Judge Doom who is by and large wanting to take out every tune and just acid dip them or just dip them into some kind of chemical of his own taking or making. And we also have Roger Rabbit, who seems to be the top star of Looney Tunes, or top star of just cartoons right now, and he is, I guess, the one that every kid is watching. And so recently, we have Roger Rabbit who lands Jessica Rabbit, who is really a big knockout. Of course, if you've ever seen visuals of Jessica Rabbit, I kind of like how they play around a little bit with when Eddie Valiant is kind of with her, and how basically he ends up like he ends up like knocking into her chest, or he ends up uh, just kind of like bopping into her every once in a while. I thought that was kind of a little funny, kind of joke of sorts. So now I'm just gonna go into spoilers. Just gonna talk through some of this. If anything, there might be stuff that details kind of elude me, because there's a lot going on within this movie. You could break it down a lot more simply and be done with it. But I'm just gonna like at some points. There's gonna be some tangent points where I'm gonna come back to certain scenes, probably through this review. There's probably gonna be some stuff that I'm just gonna kind of hash out through a number of things. So let's go into that double five to otherwise justify a spoiler variation of this movie. So, spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about the time I'm going to spoil this movie. So, now that we're into spoilers, so I kind of didn't like how you have like Eddie Valiant that has to find his brother's killer, and then also has to like figure out this case, because I'm like, god, that is like the sleaziest way about like tying everything together at the end of this in a nice neat little bow. I hated that. I'm like, so you gotta have some like villainish person that is tied to everything in this city. Oh, great. Roll your eyes at that one. But anyways, so in the very beginning of this movie, we have this like whole cartoonish scene where we have it to where Roger Rabbit is trying to take care of a baby, and so reasonably this baby is, of course, just going throughout this kitchen, trying to see how much danger he can get into, to where Roger Rabbit is scrambling to get to the baby, and there are so many things being put into the fray of Roger Rabbit, really. Getting a teapot falling upon his head, getting to the point where he gets shoved in the oven, getting to the point where he ends up having knives being thrown at him. You have this baby kind of walking through these plates that are put in the sink, eventually getting to even more times where Roger Rabbit is going to be flung somewhere or hit with things, but to the point where he barely scathes away from all of them. To at the very end of this scene, getting hit with a fridge, and the director yells "cut" because ultimately the problem is that Roger Rabbit needed to see stars, but instead he's seeing Tweety birds at the end of all of this. I'm like, dude, that's stupid. And ultimately, they evidently showcase the director is like, God, I've dropped like this refrigerator on you like 20 times now, and you have yet to give me stars. I want stars. I don't want Tweety birds. So you have Roger Rabbit that is consistently bashing himself in the head to try to get stars, but it's not happening. So here's where we are basically told within this scene. Well, we have a baby who is now a 50-year-old a man that is in a 3-year-old body, ultimately smoking cigars and yelling off that he's like, I'm going to be in my trailer until you get this scene right. So we have it to where we have Eddie Valiant that is going to be in the fray of this character named Maroon, who ultimately is seemingly having on loan some Disney-esque like characters, and reasonably he is offering Eddie a case to investigate Jessica Rabbit, because it seems that word's getting around that Jessica is having private sessions with people after her song and dances are over, let's just say. And so Maroon wants Eddie Valiant to investigate this. Eddie Valiant goes into this bar and asks this bartender named Dolores to ultimately get him a camera. And we kind of set up that Dolores seems to have a previously existing relationship with this person, ultimately desperately asking, hopefully, that Eddie can get these $50 for this case, because Eddie seems to have nothing to his name. So Dolores gives him this camera. He asks if there's film in it and everything like that. So Eddie goes on his way to see Jessica Rabbit. It seems like everybody's enamored about this Jessica Rabbit character, and at this nightclub, and he's like, well, like why is everybody like oogling ogling over a rabbit? This makes no sense. And ultimately, within this bar, we have Eddie, who eventually bumps into Betty Boop, and he's like, oh, hey, Betty Boop, you still got it. So we have it to where eventually Jessica Rabbit shows herself, and then then Eddie Valiant is like, oh my god. Eddie is like, wow. Oh, I can see what everybody's enthralled about. And you have Acme, you have Mr. Acme that is sitting right next to Eddie and like kind of like adjusting his tie, he's sweating and everything like that. So we we have Eddie who is just in awe about Jessica Rabbit. So after this performance is all over, you have Acme and Jessica going into her, I guess, her dressing room. You have Valiant who is right behind them, looking through her keyhole. You have this big bouncer monkey who is tossing Eddie out of the nightclub for ultimately Eddie to see some window where Acme and Jessica Rabbit are doing patty cake, or what we are to assume is patty cake, because everything of what going on is just Acme yelling out the words patty cake as loud as he can. So we have to where Eddie is showcasing photos to Roger Rabbit, because evidently these photos could be easily done right away, showcasing to Roger Rabbit that, hey, like I found your woman, like two timing you with Acme. So Eddie Valiant gives Roger Rabbit the photos, and Roger Rabbit is denying it. He's like, it can't be true. And so he showcases the patty cake photos, and Roger Rabbit's like, patty cake, and so Maroon and Eddie are trying to convince Roger Rabbit. It's like, well, hey man, like there's other fish in the sea. Like, hey, like you're a big talent. You'll be able to find any woman out there. And Roger Rabbit grabs Eddie, and he's like, no, the only woman that's for me is Jessica Rabbit, and he goes shotting out into the glass, and now we eventually find out that Acme is dead. So naturally, we are to assume that Roger Rabbit had done it, and reasonably, what had happened was a safe had landed upon Acme's head, and ultimately Acme was at Acme headquarters, or an Acme warehouse. To where eventually all the detectives are showcasing all the little goofy little gadgets that the Toons could use, like a hammer that has a boxing thing out of it, or a boxing glove that flies out of it, or you have a hole, a black hole that you can kind of put your hand or whatever, your leg or whatever into. Little gags and stuff that's going to be used later on in the film. So we are to have Eddie Valiant also in this investigation, because I guess he was the last person to see Acme alive, because justifiably he was at the nightclub where Acme was at. And so it seems like they are tying this case onto Roger Rabbit, and Eddie Valiant is like, okay, well, all right, well, like I don't care, like dude, like I had this guy last night, kind of threatening me to tell me that Jessica Rabbit's going to be his only gal, so probably did do it. So we have Eddie going to his seemingly office, but it's also like his office slash apartment slash uh, cleaning his clothes in his sink, because that's ultimately what he does. So we have where Eddie is going to his office and meeting again, or meeting for the first time, Baby Herman, and Baby Herman is mentioning to Eddie that it's like, hey, there's something suspicious about Acme's death. If ultimately Eddie or Acme was going to release this will that ultimately was going to release uh, Toontown to all the tunes, and so ultimately there's something suspicious about this death. I want you to look into it, because if anything, it isn't actually Roger Rabbit's fault. I think there's somebody else tied to this. If anything, Baby Herman was offering to pay Eddie Valiant for this kind of information or this investigation, and Eddie wanted none of it because he wasn't willing to work with Toons. Because ultimately, we will find out that a brother had killed, uh, or Eddie's brother had been killed by a Toon, and he could never figure out who that Toon was. So he is never willing to work with any Toons because of his brother's death. So we have it to where Eddie goes and is just kind of looking over some stuff, looking over some newspapers, and then ultimately looking over the photos that he took the night before. Realizes through getting a magnifying glass that Acme did have the will on him last night. And so it seems that Baby Herman had some kind of, like, there was something right, that Baby Herman was mentioning. So, but Eddie also just really doesn't care. So he goes to bed, ultimately to be surprised by Roger Rabbit being in his own bed before Eddie even got to it. So Roger Rabbit is also desperately wanting Eddie to do his case to solve who the other culprit is, because he would have never have killed anybody. And Eddie wants nothing to do with this case, to the point to where Roger Rabbit is storming off into a closet, and Eddie's just like, God, you moron, you locked yourself in a closet. So Eddie opens the door, and Roger Rabbit handcuffs him. Eventually, it seems the more and more that Eddie and Eddie and Roger talk, it seems that Eddie is more convinced that Roger didn't actually do this. Roger also had a paper note that was going to be for Jessica to write out all the ways of which that he loved her. And so reasonably, we also, before in the nightclub, had Acme mentioning about invisible ink at some point. And I was like, okay, well, how is that going to come into play later? Because there's something about that. So when the Weasels ultimately make their way to Eddie's office to ultimately talk if he has seen Roger Rabbit, we had to where when Eddie opens the door to get Roger out of his closet, Roger cuffs Eddie to him. So the Weasels eventually make their way to his office to ask about information. Eddie's not giving them nothing, and all while eventually shoving Roger Rabbit consistently into his sink, where also he is trying to supposedly clean his clothes, supposedly. So we have it to the Weasel is asking for information, getting nowhere, and then eventually leaving. So we now have to have Roger and Eddie scramble to get these cuffs off. Eddie goes to the bar ultimately to have Dolores give him a saw to saw off these cuffs. Funny enough, we have it to where while Eddie is trying to saw off this cuffs, Roger Rabbit is holding the piece to steady Eddie to or steady Eddie's arm to get these cuffs off, and immediately mentioning that Roger could have been uncuffed at any moment, but it wasn't a funny enough moment to do so. So, and Eddie was like, "Mother, like, dude, I had to like sneak you in here in my trench coat," and ultimately, like, Dolores was like, is there a rabbit in your trench coat, or are you nice, or are you happy to see me?" And consistently tying these two characters to ultimately have a relationship with one another, and that eventually Eddie is wanting to have them run away together on and to go to some vacation together and some beach or something somewhere, to buy a new to have her to have Dolores buy a new bathing suit because they're going to go out and uh, go on a vacation. So we we have here to where eventually Eddie gets the cuffs off to eventually try to go and do some investigating himself, but then ends up going back to the bar at some point. There's an interesting scene where at some point in this movie, Eddie goes to see Jessica Rabbit again to eventually find some other variation of Jessica Rabbit. And while going through this hotel, ultimately falls into this elevator, falls out of the elevator, and then sees this Jessica Rabbit, which isn't actually the Jessica Rabbit, and then eventually, while opening this door, falls all the way down to the very bottom of this hotel building. Very interesting animated moments here. Uh, where ultimately we have Mickey Mouse and Bugs Bunny giving a spare parachute to Eddie Valiant, but it's actually a spare tire instead. But you have consistently a moment where Eddie is seemingly going to consistently fall. We have the Tweety Bird that is ultimately going to pull every single one of Eddie's fingers to fall even further. And so we have where Eddie eventually just gets caught by this look-alike Jessica Rabbit, kisses him, and it's like, okay, that moment was so bizarre. So we eventually get Eddie to come back to the bar. It seems reasonably that if it's not Roger Rabbit, then it could be any number of people. It probably could be Jessica Rabbit that is trying to kill off Roger Rabbit for the money, or there's something shady going on with these companies or something like that. It seems like somebody wants to put there's some star somewhere that wants to kill Roger Rabbit so they can be the head star, and maybe it could be any number of tunes. So Eddie goes back to the bar, and we have it to where eventually uh, Roger Rabbit is performing this cabaret of sorts, or this show tune show for all these people at the bar, and Eddie's like, "Oh my god, dude, I tried to sneak you in here for any of these people at the bar try to call you out, to try to like snuff you out so that way they can get any reward or they can just get you arrested. So we we have to where the Weasels and Judge Doom are making their way to this bar, and it seems like there might have been some remnants of a tune being there. Judge Doom is sniffing this out. It seems like the record on the record player is of a tune like song. So recently, Judge Doom is sniffing out that there is a tune here. He's offering the bar patrons $5,000 for any information of this. We have one of the bar patrons that is making up that he's like, yeah, I have a rabbit right here next to me. It's Harvey, kind of mentioning an old fashioned movie about a pretend rabbit named Harvey that I remember the movie of. It's kind of like a black and white film. But anyway, so ultimately having the same guy from It's a Wonderful Life in that movie, the main guy, I think is like George. George was probably the name of that guy in that movie. But anyways, mood point. Ultimately, we have Doctor Doom, who is like, well, if there's a tune in here, he has to conform to the shave and the haircut song. You always have to have the two bits in there. So recently, Christopher Lloyd, who is Judge Doom, uh, ultimately he was also at the Acme headquarters where Acme had died, to ultimately showcase what he does to all of the tunes. Where ultimately he knows that there is a tune somewhere that isn't quite going to be a fitting in thing, or just kind of a nuisance. And so recently he dips a tune into this dip, ultimately mentioning all the chemicals that are being a part of it, and taking a animated shoe to its death. So now we are in this bar, and consistently Christopher Lloyd is doing the shave and the haircut and just waiting. Shave and a haircut. Hey, like consistently knocking everywhere into the bar, trying to see if Roger will conform to this. Eddie is like, oh yeah, I'm sure he won't be able to easily fall for this, and you just see like Roger Rabbit just like, he's like going crazy. He's trying not to conform to it, but he bashes through the wall and says 2 bits. To ultimately, we have Judge Doom, who is going to try and push Roger Rabbit into the dip, having the Weasels get the dip out for him, and he's going to place Roger Rabbit into the dip. But Eddie is offering up one last drink for Roger Rabbit, and we have the whole like duck season, rabbit season thing. And to where ultimately Eddie is like, you want this drink, and Roger Rabbit's like, no, I don't think I want it. And he's like, you do, you don't, you don't, you do, you do. That to the point where eventually reverse psychology, Roger Rabbit does want the drink. He does take the drink, and then he slingshots all over the gosh darn place, and to where eventually Eddie is like shoving like Dolores down by grabbing onto seemingly the outfit of her cleavage and pushing her down to where she doesn't get hit. So we have it to where ultimately Roger and Eddie both escape, rushing out of this bar, and they try to steal the Weasel vehicle at first. But then they realize that there's an animated vehicle that's a animated taxi that can talk in the back of the vehicle, so they take that instead. So we reasonably have it within this film that we have Eddie and Roger both in this movie theater where they're trying to hide out. They're trying to slip away from the weasels. We have Dolores, who makes her way to the same movie theater and is kind of giving them a little bit of information about anything that she knows. So, while that is happening, Eddie is also telling Roger Rabbit about his dead brother that had been killed by a tune, and that ultimately Roger Rabbit is like, "Oh, that's why you hate tunes. That's why you hate me. If anybody killed my brother, that was a tune, I'd probably hate me too." And this, and that, what have you. So eventually we get out of this theater, but right before we do, we get some informational little ditty that confirms that Acme and Maroon were business partners together, and they were sealing some big contract like deal. And that's where Eddie yells out, "Oh my God, that's the motive. That's the motive. That's the reason why Acme had to die, because of this whole merger." So Eddie eventually slips his way to go to Maroon, but before that happens, uh, we have it to where at some point in this movie, Jessica is wanting to pay Eddie Valiant any number of money to try to make it so that Roger is not a culprit of all this, and she is also confessing information that she was uh, told to. Um, she was told to buy Maroon to do this dressing room patty cake with Acme, or otherwise Roger Rabbit wouldn't be able to work again. So, ultimately, Roger or Jessica Rabbit was trying to very much desperately get Eddie to help her, and all the while Eddie was like changing clothes and ultimately consistently bumping into Jessica Rabbit's chest and stuff like that. Kind of little funny little ditties. It seemed that uh, Eddie had dropped his pants at a wrong time, to where Dolores is making her way into Eddie's office and mentioning like, "Oh, hey, like, are you dipping into watercolors, Eddie?" And so Eddie is trying to confirm to Dolores, like, "Dude, I had nothing to do with that woman. I have no interest in being with Jessica Rabbit. The only girl that I have eyes on is you," kind of thing. So I thought that portion of this movie was kind of interesting. I thought it was kind of fun. But anyways, so pushing on. So we have Eddie eventually going into seeing Maroon and wanting him to squeal, uh, wanting him to confess and tell us why he did it. Why do this? Ultimately, we have Maroon, who confirms that Judge Doom desperately wanted this, desperately wanted Toontown, and so we ultimately find out that Judge Doom is really the villain behind all of this, and Maroon gets 2 bullets in his back for his trouble, confessing all this, mentioning how trying to get this whole merger together to ultimately try to sell off Toontown to someone. So we have to where Eddie is trying to run off to try to get this murderer, this villain, and which is ultimately Judge Doom. And so reasonably we have here to where Eddie is now conforming to, okay, I will use this animated taxi to get anywhere that I need to, and I will also use these use this animated gun that has these animated bullets with all these like old cowboy western like bullets, and so yeah, like Eddie's now conforming to use any means necessary to take Judge Doom down. So reasonably, we have Doom eventually like confessing that he wants to that he wanted to buy Toontown, and eventually he wanted to make highways out of them, uh, to make a whole entire highway out of Toontown, and reasonably that was the whole crux of him wanting to just kind of like take Toontown and and dip the whole thing and kill all the Toons and do his own kind of justice because uh, with this city or with this town, because reasonably it's absurd and this and that. So we eventually get it to where Eddie is trying to uh, chase after Judge Doom, but he gets the slip because ultimately the dip ends up going onto the animated taxi, and the taxi ends up crashing into this pole, and to where ultimately we have the judge who ends up kidnapping Jessica Rabbit, and so we have this mad dash scramble to where Eddie is trying to get to Judge Doom, and where he has to forcibly go and take him down is of course at the Acme warehouse where ultimately Acme had died previously. So we end up having it to where eventually Roger Rabbit and Jessica Rabbit are both tied up, and so reasonably we have Eddie Valiant who is seeing all these weasels that are around that are kind of controlling this contraptions or these contraptions to try to spray the dip onto Jessica and Roger Rabbit, and this big, like huge, like machine-esh like thing that is going to be spraying dip onto both Rabbit characters. So eventually, Eddie is finally having to try to fight off Judge Doom, and while Judge 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 Doom is eventually at some point losing certain parts of his persona. It seems at some point he loses an eye at some point. We eventually find out that Judge Doom is not actually what he appears to be. And the more Eddie tries to fight Judge Doom and his weasels, we ultimately have Eddie who has to perform some song and dance to otherwise have the weasels all laugh to death, because that is the consistent punchline that Judge Doom gives to all of his weasels. It's like, hey, stop laughing. If anything, if you continue to laugh, you're gonna laugh yourself to death. So that is the foreshadowing of what is to happen at the very end of this movie. So Eddie ends up putting up this song and dance where he has to rhyme and he runs out of time and like and this and that. And so he ends up like throwing all these like balls up to where you think that he's going to juggle all of them, but instead he's going to let every single one of them hit him on the head, and he's going to be pogo sticking around this warehouse and jumping all over the place and just getting annihilated and getting flipped and shoved everywhere to where making all these weasels laugh to death and die. And then we have to where Judge Doom ultimately is going to fight Eddie Valiant. So, and here are some very goofy moments as well. There's a lot of goofy moments going in this movie. There's even goofy in this movie, which ultimately they have to kind of quickly reference. But anyways, so we have in the scene here where Judge Doom confesses that actually he is the person that had killed Eddie Valiant's brother, and he himself is an actual toon, a toon that has animated eyes and has a arm that can seem to be any number of things. Eventually, we have to where it seems that Judge Doom is getting the advantage on Eddie, but eventually Judge Doom has a sword where eventually Eddie is going to grab his own sword, but it's an animated sword that bizarrely doesn't do anything but sing bizarrely. So Eddie just throws away this sword to ultimately just get a magnet, and Judge. I don't know why I can't see Judge right now. Judge Doom ultimately uses the magnet against Eddie to kind of like reverse the polarity or reverse the way of which this magnet is going to uh, thrust Eddie you thrust this magnet backwards to have Eddie be stuck to some dip barrel, and now uh, Judge Doom is going to get uh, a bulldozer to kill Eddie Valiant, and we have a tour. Of course, every single one of these tricks are going to be used that were used earlier. We have these black hole, these little black holes that are going to be uh, used to detach this magnet to ultimately get Eddie to get out of this bulldozer. And here's the actual interesting part that I liked. So we have to where consistently we have this mad scrambling to consistently adjust this sprayer that is going to hit the rabbits at some point. And but Eddie is hitting the toggle and it goes the other way and then it comes back and then like consistently this is going off and on. But then eventually Eddie is still like trying to get this sprayer to go an opposite way consistently. But if anything, we have within this bulldozer eventually to where Eddie is going to try to hit Judge Doom with uh, this seemingly container of sorts, and this container is glue or super glue, to where Judge Doom is like has his hand uh, and he accidentally hits the bulldozer with his hand and gets stuck to the bulldozer, and then every single time like the glue is just all over the place and Judge Doom is consistently like falling or kind of slipping away, seemingly going further and further into this bulldozer to where eventually he is going to get flattened. But the only thing is that this character is still an animated character, so he doesn't die like a normal human does. So eventually he gets like helium to blow himself up, which is a really cool animated visual, to where he goes right back at Eddie Valiant again. To where Eddie Valiant has to use again some more of the weapons and or tropes that are in this headquarters or in this warehouse. Eventually using the hammer that has the boxing glove that shoots out. Eventually to have it to where all the dip, instead of it leaking out or spraying out onto the rabbits, instead of the back of the device that is spraying onto the rabbits is actually being uh, sprayed out onto Judge Doom's character, and Judge Doom is melting at this moment. You have the machine telling us that it's draining every single little bit of dip out of this sprayer to otherwise be doused onto this entire ground like environment. And it seems that the sprayer has completely uh, used all of is no longer spraying. So here's the bizarre thing that makes no sense to me, as well as some portions of this movie. So we now have to have we now have like fizzled out this villain. He dies in the Wizard of Oz like way, and so now we have both rabbits that are like, oh my god, like, but we still need to be able to like walk out of this warehouse. Like, how are we going to be able to do that, Eddie Valiant? So we have it to where now Eddie is like just toggling on this water device that I guess was created just for this moment. So we have these like fire hydrants that are all of a sudden exploding with water bizarrely, that makes no sense. And that is what is like getting all the dip to drain out of the this warehouse, to where now Jessica and Roger can now walk through this warehouse without having to be killed, I guess. So we eventually have all the cops head all to this warehouse, and we have all the toons that are also heading into this warehouse that are just like, oh my god, like I guess this was the villain out of all this, and yeah, recently that's how like basically the movie just eventually just concludes or finishes up. Uh, a very interesting, just tons of animated visual coming into this place and to kind of conclude this movie. And so yeah, just we have it to where that is easily the conclusion of this movie. It doesn't seem like there was going to be like a like Eddie and Dolores were going to get married, and that's how they end the movie. But yeah, it seemed like good graces for everybody. Yeah, huzzah, huzzah. And that's how the movie just fizzles out and ends. So yeah, I thought it was fun. I thought it was just kind of like a fun movie. It kind of gives me old school fashion vibes of Looney Tunes, and like just kind of just it was really fun. It's a very goofy, pardon the pun movie, uh, but it still holds up. It's still really fun, and even if the little tropes and stuff like that are kind of annoying, or some of the approaches of this movie is kind of annoying, or there's because I think that's when you kind of get out of stop watching cartoons, because there's some stuff where like some of the characters are so outlandish and have to just be in your face about everything that it's kind of off-putting at some points. But anyways, I think that's all I wanted to say about this movie. Yeah, so I'm gonna get out of here. Bye, everybody. Bye, everybody.